Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Confabulating. We are delighted to be joined this evening by Dr. Eric Cline of the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences, who will be delivering a talk entitled 1177 BC Updated, Revisiting the Late Bronze Age Collapse. Eric is a professor of classical and ancient Near Eastern studies and anthropology, the former chair of the Department of Classical and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, and the current director of the GWU Capitol Archaeological Institute. He is a National Geographic Explorer, a Fulbright Scholar, NEH Public Scholar and Getty Scholar, and an award-winning teacher and author. In May 2015, he was awarded an honorary doctoral degree, honoris causa, from Muhlenberg College. He is an experienced and active field archaeologist with more than 30 seasons of excavation and surveyed to his credit since 1980 in Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Cyprus, Greece, Crete, and the United States. He's written over 20 books translated into 19 languages and more than 130 articles and book reviews. His most recent book, Digging Up Armageddon, The Search for the Lost City of Solomon, examines the 1925 excavation of Megiddo and debates over the findings. His other publications cover topics as broad as the Trojan War, the Bronze Age collapse, the life and times of Pharaoh Ramses III, ancient empires from Mesopotamia to Islam, and the Bronze Age Aegean. He's a three-time winner of the Biblical Archaeology Society's Best Popular Book on Archaeology Award, and at the George Washington University, he's won the Trachtenberg Prize for Teaching Excellence, as well as the Trachtenberg Prize for Faculty Scholarship. He has also won the Archaeological Institute of America's Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching Award, and has been nominated 3 times for the National Case Professor of the Year Award. Furthermore, his book 1177 BC was considered for the Pulitzer Prize and won the 2014 Nancy Lack Award for Best Popular Book from the American Schools of Oriental Research. An archaeologist and ancient historian by training, his primary fields of study are biblical archaeology, the military history of the Mediterranean world from antiquity to the present, and the international connection between Greece, Egypt, and the Near East during the late Bronze Age. Eric, we're delighted to have you with us this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. Let me see, am I sharing my screen properly? Can you see the first slide?
Yep, that's all looking good.
Okay, good. So I welcome you all to 1177 BC Updated, Revisiting the Late Bronze Age Collapse. And some of you listening to this today may already be familiar with this topic to a certain extent and may have heard some of my lectures before this, but I am going to update what we've got today because the original book came out in 2014, but so much new data appeared in the years afterward that I was able to persuade the publisher to let me put out a revised and updated edition, and that came out in 2021. So what I'm going to do today is give you the updated version, including some of the data in the new updated version. So, but there's a lot to get through, so we'll see if we can get it into the time allotted. So let's begin. Let me take you back to the late Bronze Age in the Mediterranean, the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean in particular, from Greece over to Iran and from Turkey down to Egypt in modern terms. But in ancient terms, during the late Bronze Age, that would be 1700 to 1200 BC, the second millennium, more than 3,000 years ago. This is my absolute favorite period in time. I mean, a lot of people like the Romans. I say, nope, let's go back to the late Bronze Age. Much more interesting, at least to my mind, because back then we have what I call the G8 or the G9 of the ancient world in this region. We've got, for example, the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, whom you may have heard of. We've got the Minoans on Crete, up in what is now Turkey, ancient Anatolia, same ancient Asia Minor. We have the Hittites. They're in purple on this map. In red is a group you probably never heard of, the Mitanni, who would be in what is today North Syria. A little below them on the map in yellow would be the Assyrians and the Babylonians, who may be familiar to some of you. We've also got the Canaanites in the Levant, which would today be Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan. And then we've got the Egyptians, of course, down in Egypt. So in fact, even if you think that you don't know anything about the Late Bronze Age and you've never heard of it before, trust me, you have. You just might not have known that, because I imagine that a number of you are familiar with Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh of Egypt, or with her stepson slash nephew, Tutmosis III. You might have heard of Amenhotep III. More likely, you heard about his son, Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh, who might have invented monotheism. I'm going to go out on a limb and suggest that perhaps one or two of you may have heard of a guy called King Tut. That's just a guess, but I'm thinking some of you have heard of him. Ramses II and then Ramses III. These are all pharaohs from the New Kingdom of Egypt, and this is the period we're talking about. It's the second half of the second millennium BC. So you already knew about this, even if you didn't know. So back then, they had a globalized society in their region of the world, not globalized like us today, where, you know, if there's an earthquake off the coast of Japan, the stock market in New York goes down 10 minutes later. Not quite that globalized, but in the Mediterranean, that was a globalized area. So from, again, in modern terms, from Italy on one side to Iran on the other, and from Egypt down to Turkey, that whole area is interacting. And you can see some of these G8 or G9 on this little diagram. But perhaps a better one is this, which my wife, Diane Harris Cline, put together. She was also an archaeologist, ancient historian, and did social network analysis, like who knows who, in the afterlife. Sorry about that. Doing social network analysis in the ancient world. Who knows who? Who did Socrates know? Who did Alexander the Great know, for example? And when I was working on this book, she said, well, what you're describing is a small world network. And I said, you know, what's that? And she said, well, if you have a system, a network, where you have everybody no more than 3 hops away from anybody else. So like if the Mycenaeans don't trade directly with the Assyrians, they are trading with the Hittites, and the Hittites are trading with the Assyrians. So that would be, you know, 1 or 2 stops away. And indeed, if you look at our G8 or G9, nobody is more than 2 or 3 hops away from anybody else. It's kind of like when people play the Kevin Bacon game, 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, name the actors that have been in his movies, and you can get from one actor to another using Kevin Bacon every time. Same thing here. So why does this matter? Because there have been very few times in history when we've actually had such a small world network that we can point to. Us today is one of them, and them back then in the late Bronze Age around the Mediterranean is another. And so that's why I think that looking at what happened to them and the problems they had may be of more relevance to us today than one might think, even though this is more than 3,000 years ago. So back then, we're in the Bronze Age. In fact, we're in the last part of it. We're in the late Bronze Age, which means that bronze is going to be the major metal to make weapons and tools. And to do that, you need 90% copper and 10% tin. That's how you make it. You can use arsenic if you want instead of tin. I don't recommend it. You'll be dead right away. But if you're looking for the copper back then, that's not a problem. That comes from Cyprus. That's easy. The tin is a bit more problematic. There is some evidence that they may have been going up to Cornwall upon occasion, but not that often. There are also some mines in southeastern Turkey, which would have been Anatolia back then, where the Hittites were. But the vast majority of the tin is coming from off this map, off to the right, where the arrow goes. That is Central Asia, and in particular, Afghanistan. Specifically the Badakhshan region of Afghanistan, where lapis lazuli also comes from. So the tin is coming several hundred, if not thousands of miles across this region. And we have one tablet that was found at the site of Mari, which is on the Euphrates in what is today Syria. We have one tablet where they talk about tin coming from the region of Afghanistan to Mari, going from there to Ugarit on the coast of what is now North Syria, and from there going all the way to Crete, to the Minoans of Crete. And so imagine if this supply line were cut at any point and you suddenly can't get tin anymore, and then you can't make bronze. That is one of the things I think happened at the end of the late Bronze Age. And indeed, tin was so important back then that my friend and colleague, Carol Bell, who is working in England, she studied this and she said, you know, tin to them back then is like petroleum to us today. That's how important it was, right? And, you know, we have gas crises all the time when oil supplies are messed with. Even today, I think maybe even more than oil, maybe something like microchips, something like that, semiconductors, right? There's a supply chain shortage there, and suddenly you have problems with everything from your computer to your car. So think of that as the equivalent back then. Well, everybody is happily trading with each other. They're marrying each other's daughters to cement diplomatic treaties. Everything's going great for about 500 years, and then suddenly it's not. Right around the year 1200 BC and in the decades just afterward, everything comes to a screeching halt. Everything collapses. Everything that I just talked about goes away. And we refer to this as the late Bronze Age collapse. And that's what the subject of my book is. Now, this was enormous. The catastrophe, as my kids would say, was ginormous. The closest comparison you can make is to the collapse of the Roman Empire. That's the nearest thing. But, you know, the Roman Empire fell about 1,500 years after this late Bronze Age collapse. And it's been another 1,500 years since the fall of Rome. So not that I'm going to say history repeats itself, but, you know, history does kind of repeat itself. So we'll come back to that. But anyway, so I would compare this to the collapse of the Roman Empire, but the late Bronze Age collapse is something that nobody's heard of. You stop somebody on the street and they've never heard of it. So let me introduce you to it, and then to our major mystery, because this is one of history's great mysteries, is what caused it? Why did suddenly this globalized network of all these advanced societies suddenly collapse? Well, when I was in school, when I was an undergraduate and a graduate student, I was told that the Sea Peoples did it, these infamous Sea Peoples, which I will come back to. And now, to my amusement, the Sea Peoples are a meme on the internet everywhere, which is great. You know, these days people are saying, how often do you think about Rome? And I'm saying to myself, yeah, I think about the Sea Peoples in the late Bronze Age a lot more frequently. So anyway, I was told that they were the ones that did it. Since then, we've decided, no, they didn't necessarily do it, but they are a part of it. I actually think they're as much victims as they are oppressors. So they're still a piece of the puzzle, but they're not the reason, the whole reason. So if they didn't do it, what else caused it? Some scholars have suggested there was a drought. Some have suggested famine did it. Some said invaders. Some say earthquakes. And so in my book, especially at the end of it, after I go through who are the Mycenaeans, who are the Minoans, who are the Hittites, and all of that, towards the end, I say, so what are the evidence for these various things, for drought, famine, invaders, earthquakes? And then I decide, which do I think it happened? Well, I couldn't decide between them. So I decided that they all happened, that it was a perfect storm of catastrophes. It was, if you will, a series of unfortunate events, to quote Lemony Snicket. And the idea is that if you have a drought, a lot of people are going to die, but not your entire society doesn't go down. Same thing with famine, same thing with invaders and earthquakes. So a lot of people are going to die, but your society keeps going. So what happened that it didn't? And so I think that you had maybe not just one, maybe not just two, but three or more of these. And you didn't have time to recover from the one catastrophe before the other one hit. I mean, imagine you have a drought, and because of that, there's famine. And then all of a sudden, you get hit with an earthquake. You're like, oh my God. And then you get invaders coming because they're moving from their place. And anyway, that's kind of what I think happened. It's a perfect storm. And what's nice, at least from my perspective, is the new data that's appeared since 2014, since the original book came out, has all corroborated what I suggested. But the difference, there's been so much new data showing that there was drought back then, that there was climate change, that in the revised edition, I actually took a bit of a stand. In the first version, I was neutral and hands-off, being very scientific and objective, and said, I don't know which of the stressors was more important. Now, if you ask me, and what I say at the end of the revised book is, if you have to rank these, I would rank climate change, drought, as the most significant, because from that came, you got climate change, then you got drought, then you got famine, you've got migration. So it's not quite as linear as that. History is much more messy, we know, but I now think that the climate change was more important. And I know that's climbing on the bandwagon today. You're going to have people watching this going, oh, God, he brought in climate change. Well, I got news for you, we've had climate change throughout history, and all we're doing right now is exacerbating it. Mother Nature does just fine on her own, and I'll show you, or maybe I won't, we can talk about it. There are cycles where you've got this in human history. So that's the one change in my mind. But let me go back, and in the time that we've got, quickly run through some of the evidence for these different possibilities. I'll start with the Sea Peoples, which is our name for them. It was actually a French Egyptologist, Gaston Maspero, that first called them the peoples of the sea. We know from Egyptian records they come twice. They attack Egypt twice, in 1207 and 1177. And that's where the title of my book comes from. Technically speaking, the title should be at 1177 BC, the year the Sea People showed up again. But, the year civilization collapsed is a little bit more dramatic, but so that's where it comes from. So if we take that second time, Ramses III tells us all about it. It's year 8, and on his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu in Egypt, which is over by the Valley of the Kings, he, on the wall, gives an inscription and pictures. You can see them both here. And he says the foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. And then he tells us the route they took. No land could stand before their arms from Hate, Kode, Carchemish, Arzawa, and Alashia on. Now, we know where these are. The Hate, that's the Hittites. That's Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Kode and Carchemish, in modern terms, is where Turkey meets Syria, that border. Arzawa or Arzawa is the western coast of Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. And Alashia is the Bronze Age name for the island of Cyprus. So we can see they're coming basically from west to east, probably overrunning Greece, then Turkey, Cyprus, Levant, in modern terms. And then he says a camp was set up in one place in Amur, that's Amurru, that's in North Syria, and then they came forward towards Egypt. And he tells us who they are. He doesn't call them the Sea Peoples. He said they are the Peleset, the Tajeker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh, lands united. So we actually know the names of the groups. And in fact, in the earlier invasion back in 1207, there's another 2 or 3 groups that are different as well, but some of them were the same in both invasions. Well, Ramses tells us that he won. He beat them. I overthrew those who invaded from their lands. I slew the Denyen who were in their isles. The Tajeker and the Peleset were made ashes. The Shardana and the Weshesh of the sea, they were made as those that exist not. So he won. And the Sea Peoples never came back. Okay, so they invade twice, they lose twice, they never come back. But who are they? Well, that's still a big mystery. We've been playing guessing games for 100 years now. The Shardana, it looks a lot like Sardinia in terms of consonants in the name. That doesn't mean it's right, but people have suggested that. Same with Shekelesh. It might be Sicily. That's just a guess. Tajeker we're not sure about, but maybe from somewhere around Troy, possibly. The Denyen, people like to suggest that these are Homer's Mycenaeans from, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Danaans or the Danaioi, and that's possible. Weshesh, Well, again, maybe Troy, the Hittite name for Troy was Wilusa, so maybe the Weshesh are from there. The only one that we think we know are the Peleset, the Philistines. And we know them from the Bible, of course. We also know them archaeologically. And as early as Champollion, the guy that deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics, he had already suggested the Peleset were maybe the Philistines. And so that's really the only group that we know for sure. But the other thing we know is that this is not just a raid. This is not just a bunch of guys hopped up on testosterone going on a raid. This is a migration. These guys are coming with their wives. They're coming with their children. They're coming in ox carts with their luggage. I mean, they're moving. It's a migration. They're moving from one place to another. So rather than a raid, I would say that a parallel to modern times would be something like the Dust Bowl in 1930s America, where people moved from Oklahoma to California because of a drought, and maybe the current Syrian refugees fleeing from the civil war in their land over to Greece and elsewhere, and even, say, the immigrants who are coming legally or illegally from Africa up to Europe, right? Coming to Italy and England and all that. That's the comparison. Those are our modern day sea peoples. And so I think that's what it was like for them back then. Some of them might have been warlike. Most of them were people just looking for a better land and to settle down. So that's why I think they are part of the situation, but they're not necessarily the problem. They actually may have been migrating because of what was happening. So what was happening? Well, drought for sure. Previously, people had suggested this, a half a century ago, 1966. Rhys Carpenter, who was a professor at Bryn Mawr College, he suggested that the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece came to an end because of a drought. But he didn't have the hard data. He had some settlement data, he had some burial data, but he didn't have hard data. We have that now, especially since about 2010, when David Kanievsky is a French scientist. He and his team went digging at the site of Gibala, which I've circled in red here, modern day Tel Twaini. It's just south of Ugarit in North Syria. They dug there in 2010. He published in 2011. And what they did was to take a coring sample, like a 30-foot long core of earth from the dried up rivers and lakes there. And then they looked at the pollen that was in the core under a microscope. And they realized that the type of plants that were growing had changed in about 1200 BC, and that they had changed to ones that could survive in a drier climate, and that those type of plants continued for about 300 years. And then they get plants that can flourish in a more wet environment. So what they figured was that there was what they called a 300-year dry event. I love the jargon, dry event. Yeah, it's called a drought, right? But a 300-year-long drought is a mega drought. And so that's what they found at Gibala, Tel Twaini, from about 1200 down to about 900 BC. They said there was a drought there. Well, others looked elsewhere and found the same thing. In Cyprus, they found the same thing. Down in Israel, they found the same thing. Even over in Greece, they found the same thing. And here in Greece, which is what we're looking at here, it actually came from a different scientific study. This is not a coring from a river or whatever. This is Martin Finet and his partner, scientific partner, Erika Viberg from Uppsala University. And they went into a cave in Greece. It's down here in the southwest by the Palace of Nestor at Pylos. And in the cave, Mavri Tripa cave, they found a stalagmite, which you see in the upper left here, stalagmite S1. And if you look at the diagram on the lower right, this is the growth of the stalagmite. And you can see in about 900 BC, it simply stops growing. There's no water. And you can see as it goes down from the 3300, 3200, 3100, That would be years ago, years before present. So 3300 BP is 1300 BC, 1200 BC, 1100 BC. And you can see we're turning green, then dark green, and then purple. That's less and less and less water. So we're getting the drought in Greece as well. And even most recently, back in March of this year, 2022, or yes, 2023, the date's cut off here, they found evidence of a drought in Anatolia, the Hittites, and were able, through tree rings, to date it specifically to 1198 to 1196, which is right where the drought elsewhere was going on. So to make a long story short, and I go into much greater detail in the final chapters of the book, on this map, you can see everywhere there is a red dot, there is evidence for a drought between 1200 and 900 BC. And it comes from a variety of places and a variety of scientific studies. The pollen, like I described from the coring, has been done in Syria and Israel and Cyprus. Lake and lagoon sediments have been examined in Turkey and Egypt, Syria, and Iran. The cave in Greece, but also other caves in Israel and even Lebanon, and so on. So we now have evidence from Italy on the west to Iran in the east, and again from Turkey down to Egypt, that there was a drought in this region. And it was at least 150 years long in some places, and as much as 300 years long in others. So you can see now why I changed my mind, because all of this evidence has come out since 2014, right? So definitely a drought back then, which means climate change. From the drought, you're going to get famine. Famine's usually pretty hard to find in the archaeological record, unless you find like a mass grave, which we haven't found. But we do have written evidence. Here's Ugarit that I mentioned in one of our first slides on the coast of North Syria. And here we have archives that have been found. The French have been digging there for decades. And we've got archives for merchants. In the archives, the tablets mention famine. So here's just one example, a merchant called named Ortenu, who was wealthy enough that he had a branch office in the city of Imar in inland Syria. And one of his employees, a guy named Bania, wrote to Ugarit, to Ortenu, and said, hey, there's famine in our house. We're going to die of hunger. If you don't get here quickly, we're going to die of hunger. You won't see a living soul. So there's definitely famine in Imar. We also know there's famine up in Anatolia. We have tablets from the Hittite king and even one Hittite queen writing especially to the Egyptians, but also writing to Ugarit. And they're saying things like, don't you know there's a famine in the midst of my lands? And here with me, plenty's become famine. It's a matter of life and death. So we know from the written records. And indeed, there's a tablet that is basically brand new to us. It was found decades ago, but languished untranslated for a long time. It finally was published in French in 2016, and then Yuri Cohen put it into English in 2021 in an article. And I just give you one example. Here's a letter from the Egyptian pharaoh, Seti II, and he's writing to the king of Ugarit. But the interesting thing, and I mean, you can read it if you want on the left there, if you're Akkadians good enough. The Egyptian pharaoh is quoting to the king of Ugarit from his own letter. He says, you had written to me, you had said, in the land of Ugarit, there's a severe hunger. May my Lord save the land of Ugarit. May the king give grain to save my life and to save the citizens of the land of Ugarit. So there's our evidence that there was famine in Ugarit itself. And the king of Ugarit is asking the Egyptian pharaoh for help. And indeed, in the rest of this letter, the pharaoh says, so I'm now sending you 7,000 dried fish. I hope that helps. I don't quite know that 7,000 dried fish was enough. And he said, and I'm also sending you a bunch of beads and textiles. And again, you can't eat beads and textiles, but whatever, maybe you can sell them. So this is new evidence that we've got just in the last couple of years, that there was famine in Ugarit. We've also got evidence from just the last couple of years that the Egyptians, at least, were trying to do something about it. Scientific studies have now shown that in the region of Canaan that the Egyptians were controlling, they were overplanting it with grain, trying to get more grain. And they were also crossbreeding. They were crossbreeding their cows. So they took their normal cows and they bred them with zebu or zebu cattle that can flourish in much more arid climates. And we have evidence that they were crossbreeding. So maybe they're trying to do something back then. As for invaders, well, sure, we've got the Sea Peoples. We already knew about them. But there are others as well. There's a tablet we've known for a very long time, again from Ugarit, where the king of Ugarit says to the king of Cyprus, the ships of the enemy have come. They've been setting fire to my cities, have done harm to the land. And he says, send help. There are 7 cities here, 7 ships here. If any other ships come, let me know. So we've known about that tablet for a while. What we didn't know, and this has just come out with the French translation in 2016 and now the English in 2021, that the king of Ugarit actually wrote to the ruler at Carchemish, the Hittite viceroy, and he says, I've written to you 2 times, 3 times regarding the enemy. May my lord know that now the enemy forces are stationed at Rashu. That's one of the port cities of Ugarit. And he says, and their avant-garde forces have been sent to Ugarit. May my lord send me forces and chariots and save me from the forces of the enemy. So this is, if you want, quite literally the smoking gun. This tablet says there are invaders. They've overrun the port city of Ugarit, and now they're on their way to Ugarit. Well, we know they got there because Ugarit was burnt to the ground. The French excavators found 1 meter deep of destruction debris, ash, fallen walls, fallen timbers, arrowheads embedded in the houses, and lots of hoards of metal and other things buried under the floors of houses where people hid their belongings before running, intending to come back one day. They never came back. All the hoards are still there. And Ugarit, after it's destroyed, is not reoccupied for a good 500 or 600 years. So we know the invaders came. The problem is we don't have their name. It simply says the enemy. So were they Sea Peoples? Were they somebody else? We don't know. I would suspect they're Sea Peoples, but we just don't know. But to add injury to all of this, to add misery, to insult, earthquakes as well. We know that there are earthquakes. This is a map of many of the cities that are either destroyed or affected during this late Bronze Age collapse. Everywhere there's a red X is a city that shows some level of destruction at this time. And if we overlay it on top of a map of earthquakes that have happened just in the last 100 years, this is from 1900 to 1980. And there's been, of course, a lot more since 1980, including the big one that hit last February. Well, look at this. This whole area is an active seismic zone, right? So there are earthquakes at that time as well. And we know where the fault lines are, right across Turkey, down Greece, up the Rift Valley. And indeed, if we go to the ancient sites, you can see the earthquake damage on the left, the famous Lion Gate at Mycenae. What most people don't realize is the wall on the left, the big Cyclopean masonry wall, looks like it's built on bedrock, right? Yeah, it's bedrock, but it's also one side of an active earthquake slip zone, right? They built their city right on top of a seismic fault. And indeed, on the lower left is a young lady that was sheltering in a house during one of the earthquakes that hit Mycenae. The house collapsed. That rock that you see next to her head was actually embedded in her skull. It killed her when it fell. So, earthquake victim. Upper right, Troy. The city number 6 at Troy is destroyed by an earthquake. We know that. That wall that is tilting in the middle of the picture, trust me, it shouldn't look like that. That's earthquake damage. And even at Ugarit, we've got a wall. That is what happens when an earthquake hits, right? So we've got earthquakes as well. The one thing that we don't really have evidence for yet is disease, but I'm sure that we will. It's hard to find disease unless you've got, again, a mass grave. But we do have the mummy of Ramses V, who died a little bit later in about 1140. And if you look closely at his mummy, you can see he's got smallpox on his face. And there is a papyrus in the museum in Turin in Italy that says that he and other members of his family, when they died, they weren't buried until 16 months later, which is much longer than normal. And it also says they dug new tombs for them, and the men who dug the tombs were given a month's leave with full pay. And then the Valley of the Kings was closed to visitors for 6 months. So probably the world's first quarantine. So I suspect there's disease as well, though that's, again, harder to find. But I would remind you, if you know your Homer, book 1 of the Iliad, they talk about plague ravaging the Mycenaeans while they were besieging Troy. And of course, in the stories of the Exodus in the Bible, it talks about the 10 plagues. So these may be memories of a plague that ravaged everybody at the end of the late Bronze Age. So I toss that in for good measure as another possibility. All right, so to wrap up, conclusions. As I said at the beginning, I like all of these possibilities. Maybe like is the wrong word to use, but I think that they're all factors here, that there are a number of what we would call different stressors. But of these, as I've said several times now, I think climate change was the greatest driver. Again, I would say it's not as linear as it looks on this slide, but you basically have climate change caused the drought, which led to famine, which led to invaders, but you toss in earthquakes, internal rebellions, and all of that. So I think we've got a lot of stuff going on back then. And I also think that they were so interdependent. They're not self-sufficient. They need each other. They're getting gold from Egypt. They're getting silver from Greece. They're getting, as I said, copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan. They're not self-sufficient. And so when one is affected, the others are affected also. Cyprus goes down, you can't get your copper anymore. If the supply lines are cut and you can't get tin anymore, that's going to affect everybody. And so that's why I think we get this collapse. And in fact, what we get is what's called a systems collapse. This was a term that was popularized by Colin Renfrew from Cambridge University in the late 70s. And he basically said, look, if you've got a civilization or a society and you can see that its central administration collapses, its centralized economy collapses, the traditional elite, the top 1%, they disappear. If everybody moves and the rest die, he said, you're looking at a systems collapse. And that's what we've got here. And it usually takes as much as a century to have a total systems collapse, and it's then followed by a dark age. And that's what we've got here. And so that's also why the title of the book is a bit misleading, because 1177 is not the year civilization collapsed. It took most of the 12th century for the collapse to happen, but life in 1100 BC was completely different from life in 1200 BC. And so the way I explain it is this is shorthand. We teach our kids that Rome fell in 476 AD, but of course it didn't, right? It took most of the 5th century. And even then, you've got the Eastern Roman Empire continuing for, many hundreds of years later. But it's shorthand, right? Rome fell in 476. Same thing here. Late Bronze Age collapse, 1177. You can remember that. But it's just shorthand. It took about a century. So what lessons can we learn? Well, a lot of them. But shorthand, are we facing today a similar situation? You bet. We've got climate change today. We've got famines and droughts. We've got earthquakes. We've got rebellions. We have migrants and refugees fleeing war and drought. We've got everything today that they had back then. And we also are still going through a worldwide pandemic. So, we've got everything plus. So am I worried about what's happening today? You bet. We've got the same things they did, and their society, their network collapsed. So when I was interviewed by Adam Frank on NPR, when the book first came out back in 2014, I was, blithely, yeah, it's not going to happen to us. Because even though the Hittites didn't know what was happening, we know what's happening. And I said, we're advanced enough to understand what's happening and we can take steps to fix things. And he just looked at me and said, yeah, but are we advanced enough to do anything with our understanding? And I would say that it remains to be seen whether we have a good answer to his question. And I would remind you that Mark Twain said, history might not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I think we are maybe in a rhyming period right now. But the good news is that the Dark Age afterward wasn't quite as dark. And I actually argue at the end of my sequel, which is going to come out in a couple of months, that we should call it the Iron Age, not a Dark Age, because in the centuries afterward, some people do survive. A lot of them collapse. Hittites go down, for example, Mycenaeans and Minoans, they're gone as a society. But people like the Phoenicians take advantage of the chaos and they flourish. They're anti-fragile, as some have said. And so we get things like the standardization of the alphabet. And we get iron. Now, iron does not happen before the fall of the Bronze Age, not in huge quantities, right? They know about it, but they don't really use it. When they have to, they do. So this is the Iron Age. And so what we've got is basically 8 case studies of what do you do if your society collapses. And that's what I've been working on, and that's what's going to come out in a couple of months, is the sequel called After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilizations, where I go through our G8 or our G9 for the next 400 years, from 1176 to 776, the first Olympics. And I look at what happened in each of them in the aftermath. Were they resilient? Did they transform? Did they cope? Did they adapt? Or did they disappear? And so, and that for me is extremely interesting. But the other thing that I'm maybe even more excited about is on the same day, we're going to publish a graphic version of the original book. So think 1177 BC as like a comic book, right? The graphic version. And I'm hoping that we get a whole new audience, ranging from people that don't like to read to, young kids. So a blatant advertisement for 2 books coming out. But if you're wondering what happens in the aftermath, we've got that answer for you. So I know I've gone a bit long, but thank you for allowing me the time. And I'm happy now to chat and answer whatever questions we might have.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Eric. I have to say that's certainly no mean feat summing up this entire phenomenon in the space of about sort of 40 or so minutes. That's extraordinary and remarkable too, sort of the parallels that exist between the world that we have and its current challenges,
Yes.
and the ones that they had in the late Bronze Age. And I wanted to sort of start with there, just kind of taking us back before the collapse.
Yes.
I can imagine, we have this kind of small network where we have lots of smaller states kind of interacting with one another, trading, having diplomacy. I'd be curious to know sort of what were the kind of similarities and differences between, say, in relations within the late Bronze Age, and the kind of interactions that we have today between kind of modern countries.
So they're more similar than you might imagine, and that's what I always stress when I'm talking about this and teaching my classes and all that. There's nothing new under the sun. They're doing stuff that we're doing stuff today. Give you some examples, and we know about these not only from the material goods that we've excavated, but again from the tablets, from the texts. So, for example, there's an archive that I didn't even mention at Amarna in Egypt from the 14th century BC, which is the royal correspondence of Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, that heretic pharaoh. And they are interacting with the other great kings, as we call them, the king of Assyria, the king of Babylonia, the king of the Hittites. And they're also interacting with vassal kings in Canaan. But like the big guys, they are signing peace treaties. They are marrying each other's daughters to cement the treaties. But they're also trading gifts. Now, what they do, which I find fascinating, is at that level, at the great king's level, you don't trade with each other. You don't do commerce. You give gifts, but you expect a gift in return, and it better be of equal value. right? It's the same thing we do today for birthdays and Christmas and Hanukkah and Kwanzaa. You know, I give you a cashmere sweater, you better not give me like a Mars bar, right? It better be equal, or I'm going to remember that. So that's what they do. So at the upper levels, they are giving gifts. And these gifts, there are like tablets with just lists of gifts. I mean, like hundreds of thousands of dollars worth. But below that, you have the actual merchants who are schlepping the copper and the tin and the lapis lazuli and the raw glass and all of that. Now, bear in mind that there's no coins at that time. We're a good 700 years before coins were invented, but it's a market system, it's a barter system, and we know basically the price of things. And so everything you might think about that we have today, they had back then, including royal weddings, right? And really messy divorces, right? They had both of those, and they write about them. And international diplomacy, embassies, embargoes, right? Trade embargoes, they had that too. So I would say that many people that don't know this period back then will be surprised at how similar they were to us today, which is again why I say looking carefully at what happened to them may be more significant than one might usually think, because, you know, if we got beamed back then, or if they got beamed up here, we might be more at home than we think.
Absolutely. That's really fascinating. Because I suppose the initial assumption would be that sort of these societies, you know, kind of exist in this kind of far off place that's completely different to what we'd imagine today. But it's fascinating, as you say, that so much of the kind of framework that we rely on in the modern day was alive and present back in the Mediterranean. And that's, yeah, I think fascinating. It certainly builds the case that this should be a period we should pay attention to more.
Yes, we should pay attention. Yes, there are lessons to be learned. Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd like to quickly shine light, quickly focus on the sea people, if that's okay. Because you know, certainly kind of researching about this period, looking back to it, it seems to be sort of them, but you know, even today, you know, as you say, in these kind of modern memes and kind of in jokes and things, they tend to be the ones that consistently get kind of attributed to this collapse. And that seems to sort of really have, yeah, and again, that reputation they have seems to have really stuck. So I'm curious, kind of where did that kind of reputation come from, and how did they sort of get rehabilitated? As I understand that sort of nowadays we identify that maybe they weren't just these kind of invaders that just showed up and sort of dismantled the entire Bronze Age Mediterranean in the space of a few decades.
Right, right. Yeah. So yes, there has been a project to rehabilitate them, if you will. It's a good way of putting it. It comes from a couple of different directions. One, scholars have been warning for quite a while that we can't always trust what the Egyptians say at face value, right? And indeed, if you look at Egyptian inscriptions, they basically never lose a battle, right? They never lose a war, which is kind of inconceivable. I mean, even the Battle of Kadesh, they claim they won that. We know that was a tie. But so people have been warning that maybe we can't believe the Egyptians at face value. And indeed, you know, if we didn't have the Egyptian inscriptions from the time of Merneptah and Ramses III, we would probably not know that the Sea Peoples had been as involved as they were. But some of them, like the Shardana that I mentioned, we've actually known about them. They appear in Egyptian records already back in the 14th century. They're mercenaries, and sometimes they're fighting with the Egyptians, and sometimes they're fighting against them. So we've known about them as well. But the other thing is that archaeologically, it looks like, let's take the Philistines, because we know them best archaeologically. We can point to a vessel and say that's Philistine decoration. Yeah. It looks like, and this is where my friend and colleague Asaf Yosor Landau, who wrote a book on this, he has shown that when they settled down in Canaan, right, it was much more peaceful than we might have thought. They basically assimilated, which is why I would argue that they are, you know, these migrants, they're refugees fleeing. And so if you've got archaeological evidence that they're settling down much more peacefully than you thought, well, that makes a huge difference. So yes, we are rehabilitating them to a certain extent. But the other thing to keep in mind is that they are still, as a huge group, the Sea Peoples, they still are one of our greatest mysteries. We have never yet found a city that we can point to and say, ah, that's where they come from, right? We can guess somewhere in Sardinia, somewhere in Sicily. There's never been a city yet found where we can say that's where they come from. So I once said a long time ago that somebody gave me $1 million, I would go dig in like Sicily and Sardinia and try to find the Sea Peoples. But we haven't yet found them. So there's a lot of work to be done and a lot more information that we need to find. But out of all this in the late Bronze Age, and the collapse, the Sea Peoples are still out there as the most tantalizing mystery, right behind what caused the whole thing. So, you know, everybody, if anybody is able to go find a site and say, yeah, this is where the Shardana came from, you know, that would be great. That'd be wonderful. But for right now, there's still a mystery. So, you know, and in rehabilitating them, you know, maybe we've gone too far. Maybe they were as bad as the Egyptians say. But I'm not so sure. I think we've hit a middle line right now, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see that. And I think one thing that I've certainly gained an appreciation from the talk is, as you say, just how much we've still got to discover about this particular period, and all the kind of bits that kind of factor into it. So I think obviously the two big ones are going to be sort of what caused it and who were the Sea Peoples. But out of curiosity, are there any other blind spots that you think would be interesting to explore? And is there anywhere in particular that sort of scholarship in this period is kind of moving to try to sort of uncover?
Well, yes, there's a lot. I mean, and that's the beauty of archaeology. There's always stuff to find. For example, one of the criticisms that people have levied at the book, which is totally founded, is, well, this is only talking about the highest levels of society. What about the average person, right? What's going on for, you know, Joe Farmer out in the boondocks? And the simple answer is, to a certain extent, we don't know. We don't have that evidence. We've got the evidence mostly from the cities. Now, that has been changing in recent decades. More and more people have been going out to investigate the small towns, the small cities, and trying to figure out what's going on in the hinterlands of Greece, of Anatolia, of Mesopotamia. And so slowly but surely, we're getting more information about that, but we still don't know. I mean, the average, a friend of mine said, look, the average farmer in Messenia in Greece is probably going to look up from his plow and go, yeah, there hasn't been much rain recently. It's been a bit of a problem, but I don't know what's happening over in Pylos or Mycenae. I don't know what's happening to them. You know, in other words, not affected. Right. So that's probably the largest blind spot that we've got. But you know, that's true for many periods of history where you don't have the writing from all segments of society. So it's also true for the Iron Age, the sequel I was writing. Again, I know a lot about what was written by the kings, but I don't know what was written by somebody out in the boondocks. So that's going to take more archaeology, more people digging, and more scientific studies, right? More pollen analysis, more radiocarbon dating, all of that. So there is a lot to be done. I mean, we've literally just begun scratching the surface of all of this. And so I'd say our knowledge, our information is very uneven. Let's put it that way. Right. We know a lot about some things and we know next to nothing about others.
Absolutely. And it'll be exciting to perhaps see, you know, a few decades down the line, perhaps even how the way that the subject is approached and seen and what we're able to access, how that's changed between now and then, as I imagine it'll be completely different, as kind of, you know, different things are excavated and new things come about.
Right. Yes.
Definitely. And I suppose that leads me to what I think perhaps would be sort of the $1 million question off the back of the presentation. Obviously, there's lots of parallels between what's happening today and sort of what was happening back then. I think, as you perhaps identified, it's maybe not a sort of direct carbon copy, but there's certainly things that sort of rhyme. To use Mark Twain's immortal words, it's sort of there's enough resonance. So, in light of that, what do you think we can maybe take note of from this period? And what kind of lessons do you think would be worth learning?
So that is something that I tried to take on at the end of this new sequel, and basically lessons learned. And I realized most of them are kind of common sense ones that you would come to anyway without knowing all the detail. And the sequel, I mean, 90% of it is a history book, right? This is what happened in Assyria. This is what happened in Babylonia. This is what happened in Cyprus. But then at the end, I bring in what's called the adaptive cycle, where every society or civilization, rises and falls. It's like Hamilton, which we went to watch several times. It's, oceans rise, empires fall. Same thing. So I use the adaptive cycle and say, does this fit in? But I also use the IPCC, right, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they've given definitions for transformation, adaptation, coping, what do you do? And that's where I really pull in the modern parallels, because I try to rank the societies. How well did they do? Did they transform? Or did they just adapt? Or did they just cope? Or did they disappear? Right. So I go that way.
Mm-hmm.
But after having gone through all that, I did put in a table, which I'll be interested to see what people think. But I do say, look, this is common sense. It's like, be as self-sufficient as you can, right? So if your neighbors fall, that doesn't necessarily mean you fall. It was things like keep your people happy, so that they don't rebel, so you don't have internal rebellions. Keep the 99% happy. But there were other things like, if you can, take advantage of being near a major water source. So, and I know there's lots of discussions today about water supply and where we're going to be in the coming century. And if you take a look, I would say the four big powers that had the most impact in the Bronze Age would be the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Hittites, and the Egyptians, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The Assyrians and the Babylonians actually do pretty okay coming out of the collapse, maybe better than most. Well, they're on the Tigris and the Euphrates. They've got a major source of water. The Egyptians don't do quite so well. I mean, they get themselves into the third intermediate period, and at one point they've got four different guys all saying they're pharaoh at the same time, which is not good, but they don't go down. And of course, Egypt has the Nile, which floods every year. Of the four greatest powers, only the Hittites go down, and only the Hittites do not have a major source of water. There is the Halys River, but it's not like the Tigris, Euphrates, or Nile. So that is one of the conclusions I came to, is make sure you've got a good water supply, because if all else fails, you can still do agriculture. So I do make an attempt at it, but it's basically common sense. It's what you and I would come up with something similar, even just sitting here right now. But even that, sometimes the most common sense stuff are not obviously apparent. So at the end of the book, I do say, having ranked the Phoenicians number one and having ranked the Mycenaeans towards the bottom, I actually ask the reader, are we going to be Phoenicians or are we going to be Mycenaeans? And then, like, the very last sentence of the book is, we're going to have to wait and see and leave it to historians of 200 years from now to tell us if we were successful or not, right? So I don't know. Like Adam Frank and I were talking about on NPR, we know that this stuff is happening to us, but are we smart enough to do anything about it? My reaction is always, you should do something about it, because if there is a problem, you can fix it. And if it's not really a problem, no harm, no foul. So But back then they had the same problems. They didn't do anything about it, and their network collapsed. So, and again, look at what just happened during the pandemic, right? I mean, yeah, you had trouble getting cars. Yeah, you had trouble getting computers. You also had trouble getting toilet paper. I mean, wow, talk about supply chain issues, right? So I'm just saying it could happen again. It could happen again. Not that I'm Chicken Little, but you know, history is there for us to learn from, and this is a pretty good lesson, I would say.
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely, absolutely. And I suppose just to sort of finish off, I think one thing that's also really fascinating about this period is just the incredible variety of sources that are available to us. So we have sort of written tablets, we have all sorts of brilliant archaeological and scientific analysis that one can perform on all sorts of different things to give us examples. I'll be fascinated to know, just as a kind of final question, what would you say was the most sort of unusual or surprising piece of evidence that you've come across when examining this period?
In terms of an unexpected finding or an unexpected kind of scientific study? Because if I went with the scientific study, I think what blew me away most was the idea of studying a stalagmite in a cave. That had never occurred to me, that you could study it much like you study a tree, right? I knew, you know, tree rings, okay, fine. Did not occur to me that stalagmites also have these rings and that they are as dependent on climate and rain. You know, once I saw the studies, I'm like, oh yeah, of course. But you know, if you had asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, you say what? Stalagmite cave? That to me is really interesting. But that also leads to my question, which I actually just asked my intro to archaeology class the other day in our last lecture, is where is archaeology going to go from here? And what kinds of techniques and such are we going to have in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years? Because we're doing stuff like you just referred to, we're doing stuff today scientifically that they had no idea about 50 years ago or 100 years ago, right? I mean, radiocarbon and all of that. So what are they going to be doing in another century when they look back and laugh at us for how primitive we are? And that's exciting because I think we're going to be looking at some really interesting scientific advances. I mean, just look at what ancient DNA has been doing, you know, in the last decade or so. So, yeah, I was surprised by a couple of things in studying all of this. I think I will be more surprised by what's coming in the next couple of decades, but that's also extremely exciting to contemplate. But I personally will probably have to leave it for the next generation of archaeologists. But boy, are they going to have fun.
Absolutely, it's going to be incredible to see kind of how this kind of develops and what we're going to see perhaps over the next kind of generations or so. And I'm afraid to say that that brings us to the end of our discussion, which is a real pity. So I think we've already seen this is an incredible period, and there's so many different ways to approach it and talk about it. But I'm afraid we can only do as much as we can within an hour. So Eric, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me this evening. It's been absolutely fantastic to hear from you. Thanks to everybody in our audience for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you take an interest in Eric's book, which is coming out in April of next year. I mean, hope you'll join us for the next episode. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a good evening. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks very much.